Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our masterclass today with Josiah. He is going to discuss heart rate training and how we can use heart rate data to train more efficiently. Um, After his presentation, as always, we will open the floor up for discussion via our WhatsApp group message as well as the YouTube Live chat box. After that, we'll touch on some upcoming events and other discussions that we have going on. But I appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much. And Josiah, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. Well, I'll just get rolling into it, and this will all be recorded. So if somebody jumps in halfway, we'll be able to go back. But I really want to talk about heart rate training, debunk some of the myths, and talk about how to apply it to your training. There's a lot of misconceptions since heart rate training just kind of first came into favor in the 80s. I remember having my first polar heart rate strap probably 30 years ago. And I'm really bummed that in 30 years, the technology has not really advanced. And in some cases, it's gotten worse with a lot of the wearables and the wrist heart rate that's not as good as the heart rate strap. So we'll get into some of that. And I'm also reminded of a quote when I was studying cardiac rehab. One of the early cardiac doctors said something like that the heart has a finite number of beats in it, and I'll be damned if any of them are going to be wasted on exercise. So we're going to debunk that myth too. So let's get into it. Okay, so why do we use heart rate? And a lot of you have gone through the testing already, and some have yet to go through it. But the reason that we use heart rate is a really good objective measure, and it follows the workload and it follows the oxygen consumption. So you see on this graph, the blue line is oxygen consumed from one of our PNOE tests, and the red line is heart rate. And you can see that linear relationship. And so we don't want to go out and train with a mask on and measure VO2 everywhere we go. So we have heart rate as a proxy for VO2. And it also tells us about how many calories we burn at different heart rates once we do the testing. So there's a lot of information that we can get just from a simple wearable heart rate strap. All right, so this rat's nest of lines here, I'll explain what some of these are, but don't worry about it too much. We see that the dark red line is heart rate, but just know that there's a convergence of a lot of different metrics at the same time at threshold. So if we were measuring lactate, we'd call that lactate threshold. Since we're measuring oxygen and carbon dioxide, we're calling that ventilatory threshold or anaerobic threshold. And so what happens with this purple line that you see, we see a first kind of early break right where fat burning is about the highest. So the green line on the bottom is fat burning. So we get towards the top of zone 2 and we start to become a little less efficient. And then we see ventilation rate pick up without the corresponding increase in oxygen consumption. Then we see another break in that line, and that's VT2 or anaerobic threshold. If we're measuring lactate, that would be 4 millimoles of lactate. But don't worry about getting into the weeds too much with that. But just know that there is a break point, and you can feel it, and you can see it when we're measuring it on the PNOE. And you can see it out in the field with heart rate. And that's where that ventilation rate really breaks away from the oxygen consumption. You're breathing off a lot of carbon dioxide to buffer that lactate. Your fat burning has gone down to the floor. It's kind of rock bottom. You're burning 100% carbohydrate, and you're also doing a little bit more anaerobic work. Okay, one of the most important points with heart rate training, and this is why a lot of people have been disenfranchised by those heart rate graphs that you might see at the gym, or if you look into it and like, okay, I'm going to use an age predicted heart rate calculator, or the Garmin's doing it for you. You put your age in there and you say, heart rate doesn't work for me. Those zones don't make sense. I'm an outlier. Well, just know you're not an outlier. That the age predicted heart rate zones, they work for about 20% of the population. So for the rest of us, those age predicted zones are pretty much garbage. So you either need to see it out in the field, balance it with how you feel, or you have to test. So you can see with this scatter chart, it's plus or minus at least 20 beats. So to tell, two 40-year-olds that your max heart rate, is 180, and one person has a max heart rate of 200, the other one has a max heart rate of 150, you're doing a disservice to both of those people. And so that's why we need to validate it with some testing. And then we need to see how it feels when we get out in the field. And when you do that, you should find that how you feel really matches up with that objective data that you see on your heart rate monitor. All right, so why do we train with heart rate? I kind of touched on this already. It's an objective measure. It's measuring your own body. It's not going to be influenced by what speed you're going on the bike, whether you're going uphill or flat. It's really a metric of your own body. And so it can be useful across a lot of different disciplines. You can use it on a bike, you can use it on a treadmill, you can use it outside, you can use it inside. And it's going to be very reliable once you get used to how it behaves and some of the limitations of heart rate. So it's a really good, I always come back to it because even with its limitations, it changes very little over time and it becomes a very reliable metric. So here's an example. Thanks, Chris, for letting me share this. Don't worry about what these numbers are because these are Chris's individual heart rate zones that work for him. So even if you're the same age as Chris, these are specific to him. In heart rate max, it doesn't have anything to do with how fit you are. It tends to decline with age, but again, it can be plus or minus 20 beats. So that's a 40 beat range. So age is a factor, but you can't compare one person's heart rate zones to another person's. You have to test. So with Chris's zones, what we're trying to do is to make as much of this common terminology as possible. We're not trying to have our own proprietary heart rate zones that only make sense to us. And, we're going to use 6 zones or 7 zones instead of 5. 5 is kind of the for me, it makes the most sense. And it's the most universal. So zone 1, we have recovery. And really, there's no floor to that recovery zone. You see with Chris, it's 109 to 134. If he's at a heart rate of 102, well, he's still in the recovery zone. There's not really a floor to that, but there is a ceiling to it. And that's what you'll see with a lot of these zones. There's a ceiling to those zones. Then zone 2, we'll talk a little bit more about zone 2 as we move through it. But zone 2, we call endurance. So recovery zone 1, zone 2, endurance sustainable almost indefinitely if you have enough fuel on board. Then we get into the tempo zone. For depending on what you're training for, tempo can be that gray area where it's not quite hard enough to make a really big impact on your fitness, but it's very fatiguing. Zone 3 is where a lot of gym people like to spend their time if they want to get a 30, 40-minute efficient workout, burn a lot of calories, but it ends up being kind of a quality junk zone if you're there all the time. So we want to use it for some structured, somewhat hard work, but not always spending our time there. So we want to set a ceiling at the top of zone 2 if we can for a lot of your training. Zone 4 is into threshold. So threshold, again, I just use the word threshold. I'm not saying lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold. Let's just call it threshold. And we know that we're becoming really inefficient there. It's not sustainable indefinitely. One person might be able to stay there for 5 or 6 minutes. Somebody else might be able to race a 10K race at that intensity, maybe up to an hour, but it would be completely exhausting at that intensity. So that's where we start to get into some interval training. And so that's usually long intervals. And then zone 5, I'm just calling it interval. Sometimes it's called VO2 max interval, because if we did have oxygen consumption on there, we would be approaching VO2 max on every interval and spending some time really close to VO2 max. So really potent stimulus, but to be used sparingly. All right, and now keep in mind that heart rate is just a guide. It's not set in stone. And I'll show you on some of these next slides, if you're doing a hard interval session and using heart rate, we're not trying to instantaneously get to zone 4 heart rate. It's going to ramp, it's going to lag behind. And so we can also balance that with our own rating of perceived exertion. So with all of our heart rate zones, I include this graph. Again, it's the terminology is pretty funny. I mean, it's 40, 50 years old, but basically it should correspond with how it feels. Easy scale of 1 to 10, recoveries, 1 or a 2 effort. Zone 2 is a 3 or 4 out of 10. Tempo, zone 3 is a 5 or 6. Threshold, you're a level 7 or 8 out of 10. And then VO2 max interval, it's a 9 or 10 out of 10 effort. All right, so let's talk about each zone. And I want to start with zone 2. Zone 2, you hear that thrown around a lot. There's a couple physiologists that like Dr. Inigo San Milan, who made it very popular because the guy who won the Tour de France that he coached, he really credited that to the zone 2 training. And we call that the metabolic sweet spot. And so that's where we want to spend up to 80% of our time in zone 2. And so the reason that we want to stay there, we see fat burning optimized there. It might not be the very peak of fat burning, but it's the best balance of total calories burned and total fat calories burned. So that means it's very sustainable, it's conversational, and since we can stay in that zone indefinitely, it's way better to spend 40, 50, 60 minutes in a zone 2 rather than 5 or 10 minutes in a zone 4 and call that your workout. So we're looking at total calories burned and then the ability to come back day after day and repeat that intensity. You could see the benefit if you're trying to lose weight through exercise. Zone 2 is definitely the sweet spot for that. And even with highest performance exercise, what you really see with the elite athletes is a big polarization. So they're spending a lot of time in zone 2 and then a finite number of time or amount of time that's very structured in zones 3, 4, and 5. But they're still spending around 80% of their time in zone 2 or even like a high zone 1. What's really cool about zone 2, I might have to talk about it on one of the other slides, but the adaptations that you make in zone 2, a lot of them are structural. So we're actually talking about structural changes of the heart. You'll see over time resting heart rate starts to drop. You'll see, well, you don't see it, but all the changes at the cellular level. And we've got a nice picture of mitochondria. Chris was laughing at me because I had about 20 different pictures of mitochondria on my computer screen. I settled on this one. Sorry, it's simple. But mitochondria is that powerhouse of the cell. And that is what increases. So mitochondrial density, capillary density all around your tissues, even capillary density in the heart improves, and size, strength of the heart, stroke volume of the heart. And that's why you see heart rate come down at rest. And then at those kind of moderate intensity levels, some of those factors balance each other. So you're doing way more work at lower heart rates, or for any given heart rate, like say Chris is out there in the middle of zone 2 and he's at a heart rate of 135. Over time, he's running a faster speed or he's biking with more watts, burning more calories at the same heart rate. And that's the huge thing that we see the adaptation is those submax workloads. You're just doing more work and you're just getting more efficient at burning fat, more efficient at burning total calories, and all those biomarkers, insulin sensitivity, burning through that glycemic load, the burning blood sugar, like that all improves over time. All right, so what does it look like? What does a zone 2 workout look like? We want to see a ramp through zone 1. So it starts pretty gradual. On this graph, if you look at the beginning, the blue shaded area was the planned workout. This was the range the person was supposed to be in. This is a 45-minute ride. You see that ramp even starting below zone 1, coming through zone 1, and then settling in zone 2. So this is that range of zone 2, and they're settled in there and they're plateaued for that whole time in zone 2. So that's what we want that to look like. Dr. Kenneth Cooper, the reason I bring him up, he was a resident here, Beaver Creek. I just actually looked to see if he was still alive. He's 94 years old, so he's still doing good. I met him about 25 years ago at the Vail Cascade, and he was the guy who coined the phrase aerobic training. And we think of these concepts as something that's been around forever. It's really not that old. Like, he defined aerobic exercise, and he defined it as 20 minutes of continuous rhythmic exercise involving large muscle groups. But the key is it needed to be sustained for 20 minutes. All right, so what does a zone 3 workout look like? Zone 3 is into that tempo zone. So this could be a long continuous effort in zone 3 or really long intervals. And so I call, if you're doing intervals, if you're doing maybe 2 or 3 bouts of 10 to 20 minutes, I call those kind of standalone efforts. It doesn't really matter what your recovery time is. Another way to do it would be to spend 20 or 30 minutes steady in a zone 3. And that's that somewhat hard intensity. And a lot of people love to spend time there. And a lot of times we're trying to get them to go a little bit easier than that to stay in zone 2, or a little bit harder than that to get into zone 4. But if you are doing a zone 3 workout, we want to see just a very slight ramp in heart rate. And the reason that I'm pulling up some graphs based on power is because this way we can see that the power output is staying about the same. And we see just a really slight ramp in heart rate. So again, zone 3, it's sustainable for a long period of time, but not indefinitely. You could see how eventually, like, they're probably starting to touch the very bottom of zone 4 by the end of these 15-minute bouts. And if they went a little too hard, then they'd be into zone 4 for too long, and we'd probably quantify that as a zone 4 workout. All right, so zone 4, this is that threshold intensity. I love zone 4, but again, we're not talking about 50% of the time. Maybe it's 10% of the time in a week, and it might just be during a certain phase. But zone 4 intervals are a really good place to start for a lot of people. These are usually sustained intervals, so they're at least 4 minutes long, and they could be up to 12 minutes long. I really like an 8-minute interval for zone 4. But what we see in zone 4, compared to the tempo, it's a little bit steeper ramp in heart rate. So you're always ramping. And so we say, okay, zone 4, well, that first interval, they might be zone 3 for 4 minutes, 6 minutes of that. And then by the time they get to the fourth one, they're in zone 4 after maybe 2 minutes. So again, you're not instantly getting there. You're letting heart rate ramp. And that's one of the limitations of heart rate, is that it lags behind the workload. Okay, so a zone 5 interval. So this is where heart rate becomes not the best guide. So when we get up to threshold and higher, sometimes you might just have to default to your own rating of perceived exertion. Or let's say you're running on a treadmill or you're running on a track, then you might be able to use pace instead. And if you're on a bike, that's where power becomes a little bit more important. If I don't have power and I'm on a bike, that's where I like to repeat the same hill climb. So maybe I'm going 2 or 3 minutes up the hill, turning around, recovering, coasting back downhill for the recovery. It's usually about a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So this is an example of somebody doing 6 times 3 minutes with 3 minutes off. And you see that ramp in heart rate. And with heart rate, I'm not too worried about how much time they spend in a zone 4. They might just be touching zone 4 by the end of each. So compared to threshold, heart rate ramps even faster. Instead of ramping over 4, 5, 6 minutes, we're ramping in 1 or 2 minutes up into that zone 4. So you're going a lot harder. But what we don't want to do is go really deeply anaerobic for that first 30 seconds just to try to get heart rate up, because then you end up slowing down. So an example of that would be somebody, say, doing half-mile repeats on a track and starting out in a dead sprint and then gradually slowing down the whole rest of the time. So even though it's a pretty short interval, we still want to pace each interval. Okay, I kind of alluded to this earlier. but I am not a huge fan of the wrist-based heart rate. It works sometimes. And sometimes I will go without the heart rate strap because sometimes it's uncomfortable and sometimes I just don't care too much about what it is. But I do spend at least half my time wearing, a simple heart rate strap. This is the ones we use in the lab. This is the Polar H9. I think I have the Polar H10. Garmin makes a comparable strap, but it's different than wrist heart rate. Wrist heart rate is measuring infrared flow like through your veins, and it depends on the pigment of your skin. It depends on how flat that the back of the watch is against your skin. So some of the ones that you wear up the arm work a little bit better, but then you still have to pair it to the heart rate. But a basic heart rate strap, these are electrodes on the back of the strap. And so it's actually measuring that conduction of the heart. And so this is the best. This is kind of the gold standard, is that heart rate. So if you are kind of frustrated, if your watch is kind of glitching out and heart rate is either dropping out to the floor, or sometimes it's 20, 40 beats higher than you think it should be, well, it's probably wrong. It's probably the wrist-based heart rate just not doing a very good job. So I would recommend everybody go with a basic heart rate strap. I think they're $50 or $60, and they will pair usually with Bluetooth with any device. It could be an Apple Watch, could be a Garmin watch, could be any of those devices. Could even pair it to your phone. All right, so some of the limitations of heart rate. Like I said, I still think it is hands down the best metric that we have to gauge, but there are limitations. The biggest thing that I think is that it lags way behind the workload. And so if we're trying to jump into a zone 4 or 5 interval, it might take a little bit of time to get there. So it's really good for those long, steady state efforts. But then it can be affected by poor sleep, by stress, by dehydration. And you'll see over time, if say you're working out in a hot and humid environment and you get an hour, maybe 90 minutes into exercise, and either you slow way down, or if you're keeping the same speed or intensity, heart rate starts to drift up. So that's that cardiac drift that you get as you become dehydrated. I mean, it might not be perceived as being that hard, and that's just one of the limitations of heart rate. But it still is telling you something about what's going on in your body. But really good for those long, steady state efforts. It's good for zone 1, making sure you're getting active recovery. Zone 2, making sure you're not going too hard and making that a hard workout. And even zone 3 and zone 4, it can be good. You just have to know that's going to lag behind your perceived effort a little bit. All right, so let's see, I'll just talk maybe 5 more minutes and then we'll open up some questions. But some of these adaptations that you make long-term, they have a lot of implications to a lot of the biomarkers that we're measuring. So like the Aura ring that we have that'll measure your heart rate variability. A lot of these adaptations that you're making to endurance exercise is going to translate to improved sleep, improved heart rate variability. A lot of the same things that happen structurally, the improved stroke volume of the heart, that's going to drop that resting heart rate. Interestingly, resting heart rate is proven to improve heart rate variability, and just your aerobic fitness will improve heart rate variability. And so those are chronic, long-term changes. So that's that increased stroke volume of the heart, increased cardiac output. That all these things are going to allow you to do more work at those moderate intensity levels. And heart rate recovery, that ability for that heart rate to drop down to be ready for that next interval, that's going to improve a lot. Okay, I do briefly want, and maybe we'll have more questions about this in the chat, but heart rate variability, we're tracking that with the Aura ring. And I just wanted to explain, see if I can do a brief explanation of what that is. So you have 2 competing systems in the body. The sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response, high stress, high anxiety, ready for action. The parasympathetic is your resting, digesting system. And they're nerves that innervate the heart and a lot of other tissues in your body. But this parasympathetic nerve that slows down your heart rate, it acts almost instantaneously. So it can sense pressure changes in the heart. That's why it changes from breathing. That's why some of the breathing exercises will improve heart rate variability. But when you inhale, heart rate slightly increases. So that nerve, that parasympathetic nerve, it reacts almost instantaneously. When you have a drop in pressure, heart rate drops a little bit. And these are measured in milliseconds, right? So it might drop, maybe 100 milliseconds when you exhale. So it's not a ton. What was interesting, I was talking to Genevieve when I was running on the treadmill the other day. If you have really good parasympathetic tone, whenever that nerve is stimulated, so if you release pressure, if you burp, my heart rate dropped 22 beats when I was running just after burping. Same thing when I drink water. I noticed that heart rate drops like 5-7 beats after I drink water. And that's because the digestive system is parasympathetic. And so you get cold water going down the digestive tract and instantaneously heart rate drops a little bit. And of course it does rebound, but that's what we're measuring, this beat to beat interval. So if you're lying there in bed and your heart rate is 60, it's not exactly 60. It might be 60.4 and then 60.6, and it's going to vary. And so the more variability, the better, the more parasympathetic tone that you have. So maybe that makes sense. I don't know. I'll see you in the questions. So bottom line, heart rate is really easy to measure. It's a really powerful guide. And I would argue that it's going to get you to know your body better. Some people will say, well, if you always have to put on this strap, then you're not tuning into how you feel. And I would say, no, like the heart rate strap, think about how you feel, look at that number on your watch, and then you can correlate the two. And then when you go out without heart rate, you have a really good idea of how it feels to be in a zone 2, how it feels to be in a zone 3. And so you don't always have to have that metric with you. And if I go out and do a race, I don't look at my heart rate, but I know how it feels. Bottom line, it's going to allow you to train smarter, polarize your training a little bit more, make it really specific to the adaptations you want, and then allow you to recover from those sessions, making sure that you're pushing hard enough on your hard days, easy enough on your easy days, and just building up that time that you can do at those aerobic intensities. All right. Hey, 30 minutes under time. Let's open it up to some questions. If we have any, you can send questions in that group chat if you want on the WhatsApp. Sophia, do you see any questions?
Yes. We've got a question from Courtney. So, what is a normal HRV value, and is there a value that is too low or concerning?
So, with our Aura teams that we have, we're just starting to get a good read on heart rate variability. So, sorry, the question was HRV, what is normal? What's a normal HRV value? And is there a value that's too low or concerning? Heart rate variability, it is very individual. And so things that decrease heart rate. So heart rate variability, lower score is generally, it means that you're more stressed. It could indicate some health concerns, but we really need to get a good read, like a month-long value of what heart rate variability is and what is normal. And so no matter what, we're gauging it for recovery. And so we want to get a baseline first. So some people might have a baseline of 20. Some people might have a baseline of 70 or 80. Tends to decline with age. The heart rate variability tends to improve as your cardiovascular fitness goes up, your resting heart rate goes down, but it can be heavily influenced by stress. So if you have a stressful job, if you're sleeping terribly, and probably the biggest acute halt to that heart rate variability is drinking. So alcohol really drops heart rate variability. So we're using it we get a baseline, and then we start to notice, okay, I slept 5 hours, heart rate variability is in the toilet. I had a really hard interval workout, heart rate variability dropped, but there was a good reason for it. So I'm going to take it easy today. And so we get that baseline first, and then we can draw some conclusions.
Another one is, as we become stronger athletes and build our endurance, how much can we expect our heart rate zones to change?
Awesome. That's a really good question. Probably not very much at all. So what's really cool about heart rate, the reason it's such a good metric is that it changes very slowly over time. And a higher heart rate, a higher max heart rate, or a higher threshold heart rate is not really the goal. It's all about what you do at those heart rates. So it's not uncommon to have somebody come in for a pre-test and say their heart rate threshold is 150, and they come in for the post-test and their threshold heart rate is 148. And they say, oh my gosh, my fitness went down. And we say, no, look at your VO2, look at your watts, or look at your speed on the treadmill. You're doing a lot more at that heart rate of 148 than you were doing at 150. So your heart got bigger and stronger. You made a lot of adaptations, and your heart rate threshold didn't change very much. It's just what you do at those thresholds that change.
This question is about adjusting heart rate zones for clients on beta blockers or medications that may lower heart rates. Do you take that into consideration?
Yeah, so the question is about beta blockers. Beta blockers will blunt that heart rate response. Heart rate max is going to be a lot lower. So if we do a threshold test, a VO2 max test with the beta blocker, then those heart rate zones are going to be specific to when you're on the beta blocker. And if you went off the beta blocker, then we'd want to repeat the test off the beta blocker. So it's going to blunt that heart rate response and drop all those zones down. But as long as we test in the same conditions, then it's fine.
This is from Dan. If you're just trying to increase your aerobic fitness, how do you accomplish this focusing on heart rate and zone training?
Awesome. So again, I'd mentioned that zone 2 is kind of the metabolic sweet spot. And some people think that it's going to be really easy. It should be conversational, should be sustainable. It means different things for different people. So if you're coming off the couch, zone 2, it probably is easier than you thought, that you actually have to hold yourself back and you have to kind of cap that zone 2. Somebody that has more training experience might think actually it requires a little bit of effort to get up into zone 2. And if I'm riding the Peloton and I look at my phone, I'm dropping into zone 1. Or if I'm jumping on a Zoom call, that's not a zone 2, that's a zone 1 workout. So zone 2 is that metabolic sweet spot, building up a base, spending a lot of time there, and then bringing in some of those structured intervals, but using them a little bit more sparingly until you have a really good base of training.
Marilyn is asking about the breathing exercises you mentioned.
Awesome. So we're exploring, I know that Eliza has used the HeartMath app a lot, and so we've been in discussion about that, but any kind of breath training, like the box breathing, controlling your breath for a period of time, any kind of meditation, even starting with 5 minutes of box breathing, inhaling, holding, exhaling, holding, doing that for several minutes, even just a 5-minute practice a day, it's going to acutely improve heart rate variability, and chronically over time should help improve heart rate variability as well.
What patterns in heart rate recovery data do you assess readiness to train again or risk of overtraining?
So heart rate variability, when it drops, it's not usually a concern if there's a reason for it. So if we go harder than what we're used to going, we go longer, heart rate variability drops. And that's just that's an acute response, and it's part of the training process. But when we see that heart rate variability drop and really plummet and stay down for a couple days, it might be combined with resting heart rate going up 5 or 10 beats. Then that means the body's really stressed. Sometimes it means you're fighting infection. So what's really cool about these Oura rings is sometimes you can pick those things up before you have other symptoms. So it could be alcohol the night before, really poor sleep, really high stress, really hard workout. And I would say if it's that really hard workout and there's a reason for it, then we don't worry about it because we're going easier the next day anyways. But if we have all those other factors, we see it down to the floor for a couple days, then we probably need to back off the intensity. Maybe we throw in some zone 1 workouts. Maybe we have a complete day of rest and really focus on the sleep and recovery part of it.
What is your process for educating clients who become too fixated on heart rate numbers and lose touch with perceived exertion or enjoyment?
Yeah, I would say it's okay if you don't wear the strap all the time. Let's wear it to get you to know your body a little bit more, and then let's leave it behind some of the time. And so sometimes I'll put a workout on a schedule that's, ride how you feel. And maybe I'll say ride how you feel with a heart rate cap at the top of zone 3, or I might say ride how you feel all intensity zones and just go out, see how you feel. And maybe you're leaving your heart rate behind and you're just going out for enjoyment. So we want to use these metrics to get to know our body a lot better, but we don't have to use them all the time.
Magda says that she's very new at measuring heart rate and running, so it's hard for her to stay in her zone 2, which I agree. When she checks, she's in zone 3, and if she goes slower, she goes straight to zone 1. Any tricks to learn to stay in zone 2? And she gives you and Genevieve a shout out.
Awesome. So if you're new to running, a lot of people can't run and stay in zone 2. And so you might start with run walk intervals and you run. If you're trying to stay in zone 2, maybe you only run until you get to the top of zone 2 and then you walk and you keep that pattern. Or you say, right now my running is not going to be in zone 2. So we're going to use that as a hard workout of the week. It's going to be a zone 3 or 4. And again, you're going to do more of an interval format with that. Or if you can run and sustain zone 3, maybe it is 20 or 30 minutes in zone 3. But I would call that a somewhat hard workout, something you need to recover from. And the reality is that a lot of people can't run in zone 2. So walking, treadmill with incline, or running painfully slow. So if you're on a treadmill and you say, hey, when I'm running at 6 miles an hour, I'm not in zone 2. Well, it's too fast. Like run at almost a walking speed. Try running at 4.5 miles an hour, 4.7 miles per hour. And see what heart rate does. If it's still blasting out of zone 2, then you might need to just walk with some incline.
Are there any last questions in the WhatsApp or the YouTube? Okay. Well, thank you, Josiah. That was wonderful.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Good questions.
Okay, everybody. So we just want to put it out there that this Saturday, April 26th, we will be meeting as a community at the Eagle River Water Park for our contrast therapy community activation event. Kelly Dantis is hosting this, or she's helping communicate with all of our clients and members. So if you are planning on going, I would just email her at kelly.dantis@vailhealth.org. We're planning on getting everyone there at 1:15 for a group bike or hike, and then following it with a sauna and river cold plunge and contrast therapy, which is very exciting. Next week, Chris Lindley is going to be presenting on the 7 Shields of Healthspan. That's May 1st at 3:30 p.m. The following week, we'll have Kyler discussing metabolic health on May 7th at 10 a.m. Then Genevieve Harrison will be talking about balancing work and life with exercise, May 12th at 1 p.m. And Dr. Barry Sandler will be discussing Healthspan 101 on May 21st at 12. Oh, and Jen, our nutritionist, will be discussing nutrition for exercise on May 27th at 1. So that is our May calendar as of now. There are calendar invites in the Outlook as well as within the WhatsApp. I will be blasting those out every week just so that we can all kind of stay on top of it. Again, we appreciate you all being here so much. This has been such a great addition to the Healthspan program, and we appreciate the community we're building with these masterclasses. Feel free to reach out to me, Sophia, if you have any questions about anything scheduling wise or the calendar. I am happy to help. Thank you again to Josiah for the presentation and Alex Miller, who's here helping us on the tech side. We appreciate it. Yeah, thank you, everybody.